Welcome. My name is Stephanie Emmerich, and I am the manager of digital content here at Boys Town National Training. And thank you all for joining us today for our February conversation with National Training on engaging and managing learners. And our topic today is staying on course, avoiding detours when addressing behavior. So starting out, some little housekeeping tips. Again, hopefully everyone can hear me. I want all of you who are joining us today to be sure that you have your chat open and use that to ask us questions throughout. I will be monitoring that, and we'll be including all of those questions in our conversation today. Make sure when you're using that chat option, if you could check it out, and that it's set to everyone so we all can see the messages and questions and have a nice conversation today, both online and in the chat box. So thank you again for joining us, and we are going to get started first off with who we have with us today. So we have two presenters. We have John Mcguire and Steph Jensen, and I'm going to ask them each to individually introduce themselves, tell us a little bit more about themselves. Let me stop sharing so we can see who's talking here. And John, do you want to go first and do a little introduction?
Sure. Thanks, Stephanie. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Mcguire. I'm a contracts representative with our National Training Center. I won't bore you with all my life's details, but just to kind of give you a quick rundown, I got my start with Boys Town and the Boys Town model back in 1987 in the residential program. Worked in several different capacities there. Eventually left and taught public school, both in the Omaha public school system as well as a brief stint at Boys Town as well. Returned to Boys Town as part of their National Training Center, and actually was a trainer for several years, and eventually moved into the role that I have now, which is to talk to people around the country that reach out to us for help of one kind or another, and see if we can't align some of the services that we provide with the needs of the folks out there. So have a chance to talk with lots of different people from, like I said, all over the country, and it's always an interesting conversation with everybody. So that's my role now.
Well, thank you, John, and we're so excited to have you here with us today. John's got a lot of great experience and with not only working directly with kids, but also training the model and working with educators across the country. Steph, will you give us a little introduction and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Steph Jensen, and I started my career with Boys Town a little different. I started as an educator at a really pivotal time for me. I had just finished my first year of teaching, and I learned very quickly my first year of teaching that I was completely unprepared to deal with the one thing that we are asked to deal with the most, which is behavior and building relationships and classroom management. At the end of that first year, I felt like I had been through a battle zone. I felt bruised, broken, and really beaten. And I was at a point that was really a pivotal point for me in my career because I really was questioning. I really could have become one of our statistics where we see we're losing over 50% of our educators within the first 4 years. And I say, don't think that any of us leave education because we don't like kids. I think sometimes we end up not liking kids because we're in education. And it's not the kids we don't like, it's the behaviors that we have no idea how to deal with. My second year of teaching, our middle school adopted the Boys Town education model. That was my first exposure to what Boys Town does in education settings, in providing tools for professionals and for parents, really for anyone connecting with kiddos, in how to really see behavior for what it is, which is just nothing more than a communication of a need. What was great for me in this transition was that I had the same kids. So my first year of teaching, I taught 6th grade. Second year of teaching, I taught 7th grade. So I had those same 6th graders as 7th graders. And what I walked away with a firm understanding was that my kids did not change that year, but I did. I completely changed in how I handled behavior. So I think this is a really exciting topic we're going to talk about today, because this is one of those areas that I fell into multiple times my first year teaching, of going down those bunny trails and taking detours, when really I just needed to stay on track and really write the journey for kiddos of how to get to a more positive outcome in the midst of behavior. So welcome, and I'm excited about the topic.
Go. All right. There we go. Thanks, Steph. Yes, and our topic today, before we jump into avoiding those bunny tails and talking about behavior and those detours, I do want a couple other additional housekeeping types of things. Everyone who is with us, we are recording today, so this will be posted on our website. You'll receive an email with the link. We also get the question quite often, we have a download for you. So everything that we talk about, all of the, any graphics, any visuals that we show you, we will send to you in a download also. And there will be a form that you can fill out for also a certificate for completion for if you need anything like that. So just those little things that we'll have available. And so I think we're ready to jump into our conversation, and we have a little video we're going to start out with to kind of set us up with some of those detours. I think we will all very much recognize it. I'm going to hope so, because it also is one of those where when I throw out the video clips, it starts to age us. But I think everyone will be pretty familiar with this short little clip from a popular, what is it, 90s movie? 90s movie, and it has a really kind of behavior interaction that I think we can all relate to, understand, and we're going to talk about some strategies to keep us from having this happening. So I'm going to try to share the screen for that. I got to switch to this computer. There we go. I had my internet go down at my normal location, so I had to switch locations pretty quickly, and so I have a whole little new setup today. So, okay, so we should have a little video here, and I think you can all probably recognize and know what we're going to see. But I'm going to press play. And we're not hearing it, are we? Let's try that again. It worked earlier. Oops. Let me try it a different way. Oh, the joys of technology. Can you all relate with me? Okay, let's try sharing the file instead. I'm going to pause right there. Can everybody hear it? Thumbs up,
Yes.
chat box. Okay, perfect. Yep. All right, we're going to start from the beginning. Okay, I think I think I witnessed in classroom just yesterday during an observation. Yes, I think we all can relate to that, and it was from 1985. Let's see, which doesn't matter. 1985, yesterday. It's still one of those classic types of behavior. So that helps to, I think, set our conversation. What we're going to talk about. So we're going to start off with John and talk about a little bit of what that cycle is that we were seeing there, and then talk about some different strategies of what we can do to not have that happen.
All right, thanks, Stephanie. Yeah, it seems like it was just yesterday. Obviously, it was a long yesterday ago, but I remember that movie well. Hopefully, most of you can remember it as well. If you don't, that means you're a lot younger than I am. And just kind of, again, a brief setup of that if you haven't seen that movie, but you've got, I think, 5 different high school age kids, obviously, that, those of us that can kind of think back from that era, and maybe even more recently than that, some of the stereotypical groups of kids are kind of all represented in that video between, the kind of tough-looking Bender kid with the nerd and the jock and all those different, like I said, kind of stereotypical groups have gotten in trouble for one reason or another, and they're in Saturday school. And so what led up to that particular clip was, again, Bender, kind of the student there that was having the conflict with the principal, was messing with the door and caused the door to close. And so the principal came in pretty much with both guns blazing right from the very beginning. So to kind of tie us into what we're talking about here, I think one thing is, as educators, and honestly, even as parents, I think a lot of times we spend a lot of time trying to figure out and understand why kids do the things that they do. And, the truth of that is we could probably have an endless conversation trying to figure out why, what the answer to that is. And honestly, we may never know. We may have some expectations or thoughts if we know the kids or we know the families or some of those kind of things. But in most cases, we're not going to necessarily know why kids are doing the things that they do. But one thing that can be helpful is to have a better understanding, and again, it's represented really well in that video, the pattern that kids oftentimes get themselves in and oftentimes are able to suck the adults in with them, whether it be a parent or a principal or a teacher, whoever it might be. And so you start to see this pattern begin to develop. And so what oftentimes start this is, and it can obviously be a little bit different for different kids, and Steph, if you want to pull up that first bubble, is that when kids come to us, whether it's to our school or to our just our individual classroom, oftentimes our kids are coming to us with what we refer to as irrational beliefs. And there's all kinds of things that could fit that. I'm not good enough, I'm not smart enough, I hate school, teachers are out to get me, the principal doesn't like me, my older brother had this math class and he thought you were a nightmare as a teacher, so now of course I think that same thing. And there could be an endless list of the kinds of things that kids kind of have those preconceived ideas in their heads when they're walking in the door. The other piece of that is kind of what can start that cycle is just what kids view as a stressful event. And oftentimes it may not necessarily be what we would consider a stressful event, but for a lot of kids, just coming to school is a stressful event. And so if I have those irrational beliefs and I have something that I view as a stressful event, whether it's coming to school, coming to your particular class, maybe there's a student in that class that maybe, if they've been bullied, all those kinds of things begin to impact how kids feel about being in school. And again, oftentimes it can be based on irrational thoughts and beliefs. And so what happens then, if I've already got those irrational thoughts and I'm under stress, obviously that's going to trigger very intense feelings, right? It's not hard to imagine, where that starts to lead. Because oftentimes, again, if I've got those irrational beliefs, I'm going to be hypersensitive to anything. If I don't like school, I'm just kind of looking for reasons for that to be self-fulfilling, whether it's, boy, that teacher looked at me funny or, whatever it might be, but it's going to drive those really intense feelings. And so again, you can kind of see how this pot starts to get boiling really, really easily. If I've got these feelings, these irrational beliefs, then obviously that's going to have some impact on my behavior, right? And so again, if you think about those kids that at least behaviorally tend to struggle in school, what's that behavior going to look like? Well, if it's based on irrational beliefs and intense feelings, as we saw in the video, the behavior that you're going to observe is probably in most cases not going to be very functional, very socially acceptable kinds of behavior that you end up seeing. And where this really gets tricky is where that leads then, if you want to hit that next bubble, Stephanie.
Oops. I'm going to go in the wrong direction.
There you go. Keeping me on my toes.
I know. Sorry about that.
That's all right. So what happens then is obviously that is going to lead into some kind of either interaction with the peers or the adults, which in this case we're talking about teachers and educators. So there's going to be some kind of a response from the people around. If I'm the student that's engaging in all this, there's going to be a response that's elicited from those people. And again, typically it's from the student and teacher perspective is kind of what our focus here is. And so what has often happened over the course of, their experience in school or with their parents or whatever it might be, is that those interactions have often, and again, if you go back to what we saw in the video, generally less than positive, right? If you just think about the interaction between Bender and the principal, I'm not sure you could find a positive piece in all of that, other than it didn't escalate to a physical altercation, which it's not hard to imagine that wouldn't have been much of a leap to get there. And so if you go back and look at it from a kind of a behavioral theory standpoint, is that why this begins to go in this pattern is that in most cases, the behavior that we see from the part of the teacher in response to the child is such that it actually goes back and reinforces the irrational beliefs that kids had anyway. So I've got these beliefs, these intense feelings, I engage in this negative behavior. The teacher or whoever the people around me respond in a way that's like, see, I knew you didn't like me. I knew this, I knew school sucked, all those kind of things. And so you begin to see that this pattern starts to develop and this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy goes round and round and round. And so, again, as an educator or as a parent, we say, well, what do we need to do differently? Well, first off, we have to understand what we can control and what we can't. And obviously, we're not in charge of their feelings. We cannot control their behavior as much as we might like to. We cannot. We've talked in some other webinars about the importance of being preventive, and that certainly is a significant piece of this. There's things that we can do ahead of time to prevent things from even getting there. But what our real focus is today is on that kind of that third bubble there, the adult-peer interactions, is having a response that's different and is a response that's not going to reinforce their negative behavior. So as we go here, we're going to talk about some things. Again, I think if you look back to that video and the interaction between Bender and the principal, I think it's pretty safe to say that Bender had some pretty strong feelings about school and about that principal, and that principal certainly reinforced every single one of them. And so as we walk away from that event, some people might say, well, the principal did get the kid to shut up and be quiet. Well, yeah, he did, but at what cost? Pretty safe to say there is no relationship there. And the idea that there will be one at some point is probably pretty slim. So I'm going to turn it over to Steph here just a little bit. We'll kind of lead into some of the strategies that can help us impact how we respond to kids when we're getting in that situation.
Yeah, excellent. And so when you look at this and you start to kind of conceptualize this idea of the conflict cycle, right? I think that what we saw here and where I would like to kind of draw us back to is that first bubble where John talked about irrational beliefs and stressful events. We've all been experiencing some pretty stressful events over the last year, right? Everyone. And so we look at this and we kind of align this with trauma as well, understanding the role that cortisol plays in this overall conflict cycle. And so you could see that. And the point that I want to lay out is when we go cortisol to cortisol, so that stress hormone in our brain, if we go cortisol to cortisol with kids, we always wreck kids. There is no good outcome. And that's what we saw with the principal in the video was He was going cortisol to cortisol, which means stressful we were just getting intensifying that stress, which just intensifies that amount of cortisol, which then hijacks the brain, both the adult brain and the student brain. And so when you look at that and you look at the strategies because he was using some strategies, right? He was trying to use control and compliance. Control and compliance will never lead to connections. And without connections with kids, we can't reshape behaviors. We can't get to that next space. So that's what makes it so important that we, as the adult in the room, the teacher, because we're not just teachers of content, we are teachers of behavior. So as the teacher in that room, we need to have a plan so that we can stay on a path and not go on those detours that lead to that cortisol to cortisol. Because when we go cortisol to cortisol, what we tend to do is stab children. What I mean by stab children, shout, threaten, accuse, and blame. The more we stab children, shout, threaten, accuse, and blame during this conflict, the more that cortisol is going to increase. This is also where, as you saw the principal continuing this escalation, he is either in that piece of conflict, we as the teacher are either going to reinforce the students' irrational beliefs and reinforce and increase that stress, or we're going to rewrite. We're going to give them a new pathway. So when we can stay calm, when they are not calm, when we can stay calm in the midst of conflict and use some of these strategies that we're going to talk about that we can stay on the right path, then we can also provide that modeling and that predictability that is necessary for kids to shape and to develop more pro-social behaviors. So what is that pathway? What is the course that we need to chart so that we can rewrite that irrational belief and provide a more positive a more positive internal belief about oneself and their ability to handle intense situations. And so when we look at what that pathway looks like, it really starts with first being able to redirect. What is your plan to redirect students and start to rewrite that internal self-concept? What are we going to do differently? And so we have a few strategies that you can use. We look at some of these strategies under corrective or replacement strategies. And I think you can pull up that next. Oh, there we go. Yeah, so with that predictability, we're going to stay on course. We're going to chart the course utilizing some of these corrective strategies. We're going to have to use all of them. We won't use all of them in one interaction with kiddos, but we want to have lots of tools to pull from. And we want to utilize these because what happens is when we utilize these corrective strategies, we're much more likely to chart a course that leads into a positive direction with kiddos, reduces some of that cortisol so that they can get to a more rational space and make more positive pro-social decisions instead of continuing the escalation. So the strategies that we're going to talk about include using praise. And yes, we can use praise even in the midst of correction. Even when kids are escalating, we can use some praise to help bring them back down and help them refocus. We're going to talk about coupling statements, which is what I call the most basic recipe for addressing behavior. Coupling statements is your most rudimentary recipe for addressing behavior. We'll talk about cool down time. I'm a huge proponent of cool down time and having some sort of a stay calm plan for not only ourselves as educators so that we can model how to stay calm, but also being proactive in teaching stay calm plans for kiddos. And again, especially right now in the midst of everything that everyone has experienced in the last year, the more that we can be proactive in teaching kids at least one strategy of how to manage some of these big emotions, manage some of this big stress, the more successful everyone's going to be. We'll also talk about reality statements and empathy. And John, I don't know if you have anything to add there. Oh, you're muted.
Thanks. Sorry about that. No, I guess the only thing I would add is just that, if you look at those strategies, are any of those just, some sort of magic bullet to solving our problem? Well, of course they're not. What we're trying to accomplish, again, if you go back to that conflict cycle and how, and that response piece is what we're focusing on. That response is all about accomplishing two things. One is breaking that pattern of reinforcement, which obviously this is doing, because instead of responding to Bender and how many Saturday schools they're in, or the kid that's mad at you because he thinks you're unfair with the amount of homework, or whatever, whatever the litany is of excuses or arguments or things that kids will throw at you to try and throw you off track, it's a way to kind of break that pattern or that cycle of reinforcement. And then the other piece or the other thing that we're trying to accomplish then is to establish some very clear guidelines and boundaries for what our expectations are moving forward. And so these strategies, again, anything earth-shaking about them? No, but it does accomplish those two really important pieces. So do you want me to go ahead and talk about the
yeah, let's start out. Let's
statements?
let's look at the first type of when we think about, we're really focusing on rewriting, not reinforcing, and taking that cortisol out of that. In that first area, we have the kind of the 3 R's. So we're going to talk about replace, redirect, and reinforce. So definite strategies that go along with that. So if we talk about replacing, what does that mean? So how do we replace that behavior? And with that strategy we can talk about coupling statements there.
Okay. Well, again, this isn't anything probably earth-shattering, but it's certainly, again, in my experience working with kids was really an important tool. But you're all familiar, I'm sure, with being empathetic and what praise sounds like and those kind of things. So coupling statements, or at least the way that we've kind of got it titled, there may be news to you. But coupling statement really is nothing more than a very brief pairing of a description back to our student with what they're doing that's interfering or the inappropriate behavior, and pairing that with a more appropriate replacement behavior. So you may have a student that, and again, if you think back to the video with Bender, he was arguing. I think there was some, I think he maybe even cursed at one point. You could feel the tension going on there. So there are lots of different behaviors occurring. And I'm sure if you think back to some of the experiences that you guys have had in your classrooms, you probably can come up with lots of different examples. But the important thing to remember is a couple things here. One is we want to make sure that we're just dealing with one behavior at a time, even if there's lots of things going on. So typically we recommend even start with the biggest thing. So if you've got a student that's standing up out of their desk and maybe raising their voice, well, what's the most interfering thing? Well, it's probably the loud voice tone. So we may start off with addressing that first. We want to make sure that we're real brief and specific. Sometimes, again, we as adults, we have a tendency to probably what's the word? Sermonize a little bit and talk too much. So we want to just make sure that we're just being very brief and specific. What we're seeing that's interfering with pairing what we want to see instead. So for example, you know what, Stephanie, you're yelling right now. Better choice for you would be just to sit quietly. If you could stop talking, those kind of things. Instead of standing up at your desk, could you please take a seat? So pairing a description of the inappropriate behavior with a very clear instruction about what we want them to do instead. We want to make sure too that we phrase those things in the form of a request. And again, sometimes when the tensions are rising and things get maybe a little bit scary, oftentimes we start making demands and very specific instructions. You need to sit down, you need to be quiet, those kind of things. We know that as adults and even as kids, we're more likely to comply with the request than the demand. So asking kids, hey, a better choice would be, could you please do this? So again, they're more likely to comply. We're certainly modeling better behavior than getting into a big power struggle with kids. So those are the kinds of things that we're going to want to do when we're using coupling statements. And again, it's just a very brief and specific way to point out to kids what they're doing that's interfering and giving them an appropriate alternative. Again, lots of times, I know I'm guilty of it. I still catch myself. We get really good at telling kids what not to do. We don't oftentimes tell them what to do instead. And so this coupling statement strategy really is designed to kind of help keep us focused on identifying the interfering behavior and pairing it with a more appropriate behavior.
Yeah, I would definitely, Steph, do you have any tips that you could add? You know, I will say with the years that I've worked at Boys Town, coupling statements are so effective, but they are a challenge, you know, and there's any tips that you have of learning and implementing them in that way?
Yeah, I would just say it again, like I said earlier, it to me is the most basic, the most rudimentary recipe for your frontline defense for addressing behavior that you want to try and reshape into something else. So like John said, you describe the inappropriate, describe the appropriate. So your recipe is a dib and a dab. You need a dib and you need a dab. Describe the inappropriate, describe an appropriate, because in that moment, our kiddos, they're escalating. So if we can just kind of give them that brain stop for a minute and redirect into something more rational, 9 times out of 10, they're going to do it. The other thing that I really, really like about coupling statements is it requires us to stay in a teaching brain, because it allows us to stay in this rational part of our brain and be observing what is going on and what do I want them to do instead. So that helps us to keep from going into that, you know, cortisol to cortisol conflict and be thinking about, okay, here's what they're doing, here's what I would like to see instead, and pairing those two things together. So not only does it help the student to be able to make a different choice and feel like they're in control, but it also allows us to stay in control of ourselves by giving them another choice and not getting into that, not falling deeper into that conflict cycle. So I really think coupling statements, like I said, is your front line of defense. When things start to spiral out of control, if we can at least start there, 9 times out of 10, kiddos are going to be able to self-correct.
Yeah, that's really, really good points there. And especially, you know, that keep thinking about that. Instead, there's such a great tool of instead of matching what you're hearing. And for me, staying out of that content, because it doesn't matter. It's just the behavior, and it makes you put your brain into that force of what is happening here and what do I want to see happening here. Not what are they saying, not that they just, you know, they said I'm the most terrible teacher on the planet and I'm really trying, and you get out of that. You're like, no, right now you're arguing, and what do I want you to do? And really, and take, but it does definitely take practice. So what's our next strategy? If we go from replace, we're going to go to redirect. What are some what's a way we can redirect? And that would be with cool down time. So John, do you want to talk a little bit about, and Steph, do you want to talk about cool down time? And what?
No, go ahead. Okay, I'll take it. John's on mute. So we're going to try that first, you know, and again, you don't have to do these in any order. You can try the replacement, but they might be at a point where, okay, you know what, I'm just going to give you a minute, because I know no matter what I say to you right now, you're just going to continue to, you know, stay in that space of conflict. So I might, instead of trying to use a coupling statement, I might redirect, which means I'm going to give them a minute to try and pull themselves together. I'm going to prompt that. And again, I think we have to go back to, like John said, we start with there's a lot of things that we can do proactively. One of the biggest things that I think we can do proactively is teach some sort of strategy for staying calm in our space and place, so that when we do need to redirect, we have something very specific that we can provide, that we can prompt for them to do. So cool down time or a stay calm plan is a great way to do that. If you've taught some sort of a breathing technique, I like to use straw breathing. There's all kinds of different mindful practices, different things that you can use as stay calm plans in your classroom. I would pick one of those and latch onto it and give them a time frame to do it and something specific to do. So right now I can see that you might be feeling a little bit upset. I'm going to give you about 4 minutes. Why don't you just do some straw breathing, and I'm going to come back and check with you and see what's going on. Okay, so that's a redirect. I am just going to walk away. As long as they are safe, as long as they're not at risk of harming themselves or those around them, and they're just sitting in their desk and they're able to take those couple of minutes and maybe pull themselves together, that's a big win. I think one thing that we get into, especially secondary teachers, is, and I was middle school, so I know that I fell into this, is that you need to do it right now because I said so, right? We kind of have to let that go. We need to work in their time zone, not in our time zone, because if our ultimate goal is for them to be successful in our classroom, then sometimes they need a little bit more time to get to that space where we can have that rational conversation. So giving them that redirect, providing them something that amount of time, I'm going to give you a few minutes, I'm going to come back and check with you and give them something specific to do. A lot of times that will break that cycle so then we can come back and do some teaching, just like we would around academics.
Yeah, Mr. Mcguire, are you off mute yet?
I am, yeah, sorry.
Thank you.
Technology problems here. Yeah, I think Steph's exactly right. I think the thing I would add, especially depending on how old the student is that you're working with, I think it's really important as the older that kids get, especially high school age students and certainly those that are, about ready to move on from there, is that if we're using cool down time and kind of those timeouts, if you will, having those specific time, having a specific amount of time, having tasks that they can engage in are really important. But another critical piece to that is, as time goes on, we should be reducing the amount of time that kids are using or taking for timeout or for cool down time. If we're really setting kids up to be successful beyond school, it's not always a very real life strategy to be able to remove yourself from a difficult situation and take time out. If I'm in a disagreement with my boss at work or a coworker or whatever it might be, I may not be able to say, hey, I need 5 minutes and I'm going to go, work on my think sheet and then come back and try and work this out with you, right? And so we're hopefully working kids or shaping them towards being able to solve problems in the moment. Ideally, we'd like to get kids from cool down time to being able to have a conflict and resolving it functionally, and being able to express myself appropriately, being able to problem solve appropriately. Now, again, are we going to get there with every kid? No. But so, for example, if I've got a kid that we're using 5 minutes worth of cool down time, as time goes on, I want to move that down to 4 minutes, down to 3 minutes, down to 2 minutes, and hopefully to a point again where there's either very little or no time at all. We should be doing those kinds of things as we're continuing to work with kids, and again, certainly as they're getting ready to leave our school or our program or whatever it might be. I think those are a really important piece.
Yeah, and that's a really good point of, bringing it in with meeting our kids where they're at, what they need. This isn't a checklist strategies. They're the tools that you use with the particular student and with those relationship buildings. And right now we're talking about in the moment, we're talking about that cycle of where intense feelings are happening and observable behavior. And then of course you look at what can you do. There's lots of proactively building that relationship so that, those pieces work together. And I think one thing, especially with cool down time, as we think of, as younger kids, it's a timeout. As kids get older, what does that mean? And that good example of where, our goal is to get to a point where a cool down time could actually be like a 20-second, just like, kind of mental break. Mm-hmm. And then also situation. What else could cool down time have helped in that situation with the group that he was in? Because you were also getting reactions from people, and when you look at that irrational beliefs and those stressful events, some of that too is that student self-concept of saving face. And so cool down time can be very effective with older kids and in that way, because it gives them that opportunity to save face, where it's like, okay, I'm going to give you about 30 seconds and then we're going to then you can move the conversation too.
Well, and I think we need to be honest too that, hopefully this doesn't happen a lot, but sometimes as adults, we need that time out a little bit too. If we kind of let the emotions get the best of us, we're not going to be effective with our kids if we're not under control ourselves. And so while we may frame it that the timeout is for the student, I mean, again, let's be honest, we're all human. We make mistakes. Sometimes we need to be able to step away, gather our thoughts, lower the blood pressure a little bit and come back and say, okay, let's stay focused on what the real issue is here, and being able to help that student calm down. So, yep,
Yeah,
good points.
Exactly. So let's look at now, this one is a little bit of where if we look at reinforce, we're looking at reinforce, and one of our strategies that we're going to talk about is specific praise. And this is one where you think, okay, behavior is happening. How does praise fit in this whole thing? What is this going to do? Why is this an effective strategy?
Yeah, and that's a great
go
one.
Ahead.
Oh, sorry.
No, sorry. Go ahead.
This was one of my favorite ones when I started thinking about addressing behavior, and especially when it starts to escalate. And it just seems like such a foreign concept to use reinforcement in that moment. But when you start to think of it that way, or you start to apply some reinforcement or some encouragement, even in the midst of, sort of a meltdown with kids, it is so incredibly powerful. Like, it really is one of those magical interventions that you can try to use, because it really throws the kids off their toes, right? Because here they are, how do people usually respond to them, right? You get more and more negative. And so when we kind of shift that script into something more positive, it kind of takes them aback a little bit, and really does kind of change the overall tone. So I like to just encourage people that even if kiddos, and even in some of the classroom observations that I've made, even that one kiddo that might be on your last nerve all the time, when you really go in and observe their behavior, even worst case scenario, kiddos are generally about 60% of the time they're doing something that they're supposed to. They may be that 40% is overwhelming when they're engaging in some of those behaviors that are challenging, but 60% of the time they're doing something they should be. And so if we can kind of shift that, and that applies even in some of these times of escalation. There were times when Bender was sitting quietly. He might have had his arms crossed, he might have had a little bit of a scowl, but he was quiet. He was staying to himself. He was doing some of those things that would allow him maybe to calm down so that we could have a different conversation. And so if you shift some of that, even in the moment, that, you know what, I really do appreciate that you're not talking back right now. I really appreciate that you're able to sit there and be quiet right now. That's huge as a strategy for helping to shape and to change the trajectory of this conversation, or the overall outcome when you're in the middle of this conflict cycle. I also like that as you look at these three strategies that we're talking about, I keep coming back to restorative. So if we're able to stay focused on being able to redirect, replace, or reinforce kiddos, that also creates a very restorative environment where all kiddos can be more successful.
We did have a question that I think at this point of thinking about these tools together, because when reinforcement comes in, and recognizing what students are doing well, that's not only what you're going to do, because again, we were talking, these are the different tools that you're going to pair them together based on students. But let's talk about how replace, redirect, and reinforce works from pre-K to K to 12. I mean, across the ages. We looked at the example of high school kids and that detention situation, but let's think about, if you can talk a little bit about the modifications and how it might look differently for a 7-year-old versus a 12-year-old and those types of things.
Sure. Well, I think the funny thing is about this, if again, as teachers, sometimes we look at our 7-year-old versus our 17-year-old, and there's probably lots of situations where you go, yeah, there's not that much difference in how they're behaving. I've certainly seen seniors behave like kindergartners, and the opposite of that in some cases. So You know, in some regard, behavior is behavior. However, you know, whether it's you've got a kid that's either just younger because they're just, I mean, that's their age, you know, there's 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, whatever it is, or developmentally they're younger. Again, I think the strategy still can be the same, but I think it becomes even more critical that you're very specific, and that you kind of break down. In some cases, for example, let's say you've got a kid that really struggles with following instructions. That's a real trigger point for him or her. The idea that we're going to have that child, you know, look at the person, say, okay, and do the task right away like we would want is probably pretty slim.